All right, so the week for review. This week, there was a number of discussion questions, and they were all based on this question of how did the Irish actually save civilization? So we talked a lot about leading up to this point of the Irish saving civilization, and here we are officially at this point. Okay, so one question was about the monasteries and the Clonisu, Clonice, and the monasteries. Why were they important? Well, they're important in Ireland because essentially they became centers of activity. They became the first kind of Irish towns. Up to that point, Ireland was based on a society that roamed, that was nomadic, that would just kind of travel the fields, and that even where they would stay put, it was very spread out. There was no population centers. You might have a farm or a pasture, but there was no places where many people congregated together. And so the monasteries began that. So they began that sense of bringing communities, structured communities together. And of course, they're important in terms of learning and in terms of wealth. Because with the learning, and with the knowledge, and with the destruction of Europe, some of that learning and knowledge and wealth came to Ireland. And the monasteries would house that wealth. And so they also became important symbols of, obviously, Catholicism. And so they became important ways to organize the community as a whole. And they also became attractive to foreigners. Again, as Europe declined, as Europe was overrun by barbarians, as Europe was destroyed, and Ireland became the center of learning and the center of the preservation of Western society, you had many people coming to Ireland. And so many foreigners would end up at these kind of monasteries. They were unorthodox. They weren't the usual. They didn't follow the rules. They didn't do things just because that's the way it was always done or because the Pope said so. They had a different vision of Catholicism, and we've already talked about this. Certainly Sister Marguerite did, and we've seen it in a couple other places. So what are some of these differences? Well, in the discussion boards, you talked quite a bit about the idea of penance, reconciliation, forgiveness. And what they did, the Irish, they moved penance, reconciliation, from a public event that only happened once in your life. You had to do it outside, you do it in front of the congregation, and your penance, your actual punishment, your actual atonement for the sin would also be done in public. You can only get it once, so if you sinned again, you could be in deep trouble. And why did the Irish do this? They moved it from the public to the private, and they allowed you to ask for penance, ask for forgiveness as many times as you wanted. And they did it essentially because they realized we're all screw-ups, we all make mistakes, and we all make mistakes all the time. So you might argue that they had, maybe on a critical side, a lax view of human nature, that they were too forgiving, they didn't raise the standards high enough. But from their perspective, it was just kind of realistic. That's the way human beings are. Human beings mess up, human beings fail, human beings screw up, and it happens all the time, and so there's no point in pretending like it doesn't, and so we need forgiveness constantly, so why not offer it constantly? And also make it a private affair. So they also had other unorthodoxies, other ways that they didn't follow the tradition. And this we've talked about quite a bit, the idea of a greater sense of equality with women, women getting to run some of the religious centers. It would have been unheard of in the contemporary Europe and continental form of Catholicism. And they were also less hierarchical. It was also less based on, you've got a leader and then you've got these other sub-leaders and so on down the line. It was a much more kind of equal, much more kind of contributive, everybody kind of adding their voices form of Christianity. And as Sister Marguerite said, if they had followed that Irish form, it would have been much different than Catholicism today. And so finally, Clonisu. He's the guy that really moved Ireland's knowledge and learning and began to spread it back to continental Europe. He was incredibly important in this regard, because if he hadn't existed, or if Ireland hadn't started to export its learning and knowledge, well, then it may have all been lost in the Viking invasions. And so he essentially started to found monasteries in Ireland, but then was quickly moved to Scotland. And he said once his community got to 150, 12 new people would have to set off and start a new community. And he founded over 100 of these monasteries and these centers and these communities in his lifetime. And they spread and spread and spread. And that's what ultimately brought the learning and the knowledge back to Europe. So the Irish saved civilization not only by copying down this literature, preserving it in that way, but by bringing it back. So it's a double movement, copying and bringing it back. If you didn't have both of those movements, again, the Western civilization could have been lost, at least its literature and at least its knowledge. And it could have been lost because this goes to the Vikings. And many of you commented on the Vikings. This was the most popular discussion topic by far. And so you're absolutely right. And many of you, most of you, were very clear that they maimed, that they killed, that they raped, that they were cruel, that they attacked the monks who were relatively defenseless. And for the most part, everyone noticed that and everyone criticized the Vikings for that. And there was also a psychological cruelty. They were, in a certain sense, terroristic, as many of you noticed. They were terroristic because they won not only by their brutality, but by the threat of their brutality. And so if you saw the Viking ships over the horizon, that would be an extreme fear. And it would drive the Irish and the monks to flee. And so they won, not only because they were great fighters, because they were strong, because they were brutal, but because they threatened people. And people were so psychologically terrified of them. And I think it's interesting, are they different than terrorists today? Or are they using the same basic tactics? And another kind of question that arises from this, you might ask, are they sociopaths? Are they literally kind of unconcerned? Do they literally not care about others? Are they literally lack that kind of human empathy and emotion? Or were they just products of their time? That this is the way things were done. That this is the way you survived. That this is the way you ruled. That this is the way you would flourish as a civilization, that you attacked and you stole and you plundered others. And it was interesting. I usually don't mention people by name, but Jacqueline did raise this point where she said, look, they didn't need to murder. They could have still conquested, they could have still ruled, but in order for them to survive, they didn't need to murder. So interesting. Why did they murder? I mean, why did they conquest? Why did they invade? That was a question that should be addressed. Well, it's obviously because of the riches. They wanted what the monks had, the gold, the jewels, the property, the manuscripts. Also because they were defenseless, in a certain sense that the Vikings could take over, they could win, and they knew this. You should ask yourself, well, is that a potentially negative effect of Christianity? Did Christianity pacify the Irish and the monks too much? Did it leave them vulnerable to this kind of invasion? And do you blame Christianity at all? But this is important. They were certainly destructive. They were certainly cruel. They certainly burned, and they certainly decimated, many places in Ireland. But they weren't purely destructive. They were also constructive in the sense that the cities of Ireland that we know today, the cities that we'll be going to, Galway, Limerick, Dublin, were originally Viking posts, Viking ports. And so the Vikings were the ones that first founded the Irish cities. And so in that way, they helped Ireland progress in an important sense. They established these centers that came to then be the population and trade centers and ultimately governmental centers of current contemporary Ireland. And they did so because the Vikings weren't simply barbarians, they weren't simply invaders, they were also traders, they were also sea explorers. And so they would recognize where the good ports were, and they established communities on those ports. I'll end with this. The Irish, and many of you noticed this, were the first of the invading forces, but there were others to follow. The Normans, which we're going to learn about in this class, the Elizabethans, the Cromwellians, and others. Now, certainly the Irish were oppressed, certainly the Irish were brutalized by these invading forces, but it's important to note that the Irish also assimilated these invading forces. The invading forces became part of Ireland. They didn't simply invade and leave. and they became part of the culture. And so this mixture emerges, where essentially the contemporary Irish, they're not simply the Irish and there's these kind of foreign invaders. The contemporary Irish person has within them a mixture. They're part kind of ancient Celtic oppressed person, but they're also part invader, part conqueror. And so you have these same kind of this mixture within Ireland, and that makes for a kind of an interesting historical heritage. And with that, we will move on to this week, and this week is going to be about the early English invasions, the early English coming to Ireland, and some of the early Irish intellectuals as well.